Hello, I'm Marcel Wieder, and welcome to The Point. On today's episode, the Greenbelt is celebrating its 11th anniversary. It is considered one of the most important environmental initiatives of former Premier Dalton McGuinty's government. We have Josh Wise from Ontario Nature to discuss. And the Toronto Community Housing Agency is one of North America's largest landlords, with 2,100 buildings and over 100,000 residents. We talk with Senator Art Eggleton, who was asked by Mayor Tory to review the operations of the agency. And Prime Minister Trudeau continues to get high marks from Canadians. A recent poll conducted by Abacus Data gives us insights on what Canadians think of the new government. We'll chat with Bruce Anderson on his findings. All that and more on this edition of The Point. In a bid to rein in urban sprawl, the McGuinty government introduced an ambitious plan 11 years ago to limit development and designate areas around the Greater Toronto Area as green spaces. As part of the plan, there's a mandatory review that the government is currently undertaking. To discuss this, Josh Wise from Ontario Nature joins me. Josh, thanks for joining.
Well, thanks for having me in.
So, first of all, tell me a little bit about Ontario Nature. Who are you and what do you do?
So Ontario Nature is an environmental charity. We've been active in Ontario for just over 85 years now. So originally formed by naturalist groups across the province, and we still represent the views of over 150 member groups today, over 300 individual members and supporters, and try to represent their views at Queen's Park to protect wild species and wild spaces.
So now the Greenbelt is an important element in the type of work that you're doing. Mm-hmm. Now with 10 years, what do you think the results of that have been?
Well, yeah, so we were active in the formation of the Greenbelt, one of the many voices that were on the landscape pushing the Liberal government for that at the time back in the early 2000s. So now 11 years later, about a year into this review, I think many groups can agree that the Greenbelt has been very successful in terms of environmental protection, protecting our natural habitat, as well as protecting agricultural land in this very dense part of the province.
Now, Mayor Crombie did a review and submitted it to the government, and he's calling on expansion of the Greenbelt. And I know that a number of developers are very much opposed to that because they say it promotes leapfrog development, and given the number of people that are coming into the Greater Toronto Area, there's not enough area for housing. Mm-hmm. How do you respond?
Yeah, so we were very happy to see Mayor Crombie's and the entire advisory panel put forward some recommendations that did indicate their desire for the Greenbelt to grow. And it is in response to that type of leapfrogging development. So Greenbelt was originally designed to curb urban sprawl, to keep development in certain areas, promote higher intensification, higher density in our existing urban areas, and to protect the landscape, the agricultural and natural landscape. So we've now seen 10 years out that areas like Simcoe County, Brant County, they're starting to see some of the same pattern of urban sprawl, of low density, kind of car dependent development. And local groups from those areas have been getting in touch with Ontario Nature, with many other groups within the Ontario Greenbelt Alliance, mm-hmm. and calling for growth within some pretty important areas that protect the groundwater and the drinking water of those communities.
So why is it so important that we protect these green areas that you're obviously very concerned about?
Yeah, so Ontario Nature is very active in terms of trying to protect biodiversity, keep biodiversity on the landscape. So making sure that there's forests, there's wetlands, there's streams and rivers for animals and plants to live in this region. Southern Ontario is one of the most biologically diverse parts of the country, and there's huge benefits that we as kind of downstream populations or as human populations within these communities benefit from as well. So by having wetlands and forests on the landscape, we're keeping water back after major rainstorms, so that's preventing lots of flooding downstream. Mm-hmm. By having forests, they're one of the best trees are one of the best natural features at sequestering carbon, taking carbon out of the
and that's very important, especially as Canada wants to meet its carbon objectives.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I mean, the Greenbelt plan, the Greenbelt within this region is should be positioned as a major element of the province's climate change plan. It protects us, so it helps us adapt to future changes that the environment might have, more intense rainstorms, more intense other weather events that our communities need to be sheltered from. Natural and green spaces and agricultural lands help buffer us from that. And they also, as I said, sequester carbon. So if we're looking to enhance the natural systems, looking to enhance agricultural practices in this landscape, we are sucking carbon out of the atmosphere as well.
So what are you recommending to the government that they should be doing?
So, I mean, we put in a submission back in May, and we've got over a dozen recommendations, really key to what we're hoping that the government will take on is to see the Greenbelt grow. So we've put out a press release with a number of local community groups calling for this new Blue Belt. So another band around the Greenbelt protecting key water features, looking to include the urban river valleys within cities like Toronto, Oakville, Mississauga, and also to protect and close some of the loopholes within the existing Greenbelt plan. So it's been a great plan. We've seen a lot of success, but there are still some gaps, some loopholes that need to be closed. Make sure that that it's working the way that it was really intended to work.
And besides the Greenbelt, your organization is involved in a number of other areas, including endangered species advocacy and things like that. Can you enlighten us with some of that?
Sure, yeah. So Ontario Nature was one of the groups really pushing for the Endangered Species Act to be rewritten, which the province of Ontario did in 2007. When it came out at that time, us, with many other environmental groups, really saw this as a great step forward in protecting the habitat of endangered species, making sure that they got listed, that it was a scientifically defensible process. Within recent years, we've thought that implementation has not gone very well at times. There's been a lot of issues within various government ministries that we're quite concerned about, and we've taken the government to court within the last year to try to have some of these implementation, to try to make sure that the act is working the way that it was written to work.
Josh, can you tell me about some of the other campaigns that Ontario Nature is undertaking? I know, for example, there's something called the Marvelous Moraine.
Yeah, so we created a website with partners, other environmental partners, so Storm, Save the Oak Ridge Moraine Coalition, EcoSpark, and Earth Roots. We've been working with them throughout this whole Greenbelt review, but kind of at the onset, and most of our roots are in terms, as a collaborative, we're in protecting the Oak Ridges Moraine. So 160-kilometer feature, it's kind of the backbone, the ecological jewel of the Greenbelt. So we launched a website, marvelousmoraine.ca. It shows many of the highlights of what makes the moraine such a unique feature in terms of how it protects our water sources. It's the start of 65 rivers and streams that flow into Lake Ontario and flow north of the moraine, and is home to many unique and beautiful communities.
And if people want to learn more about or get involved with Ontario Nature, how would they do that?
So you can find us online at www.ontarionature.org. There you can find the different campaigns that we're active in, the different nature reserves that are publicly available if people want to get out onto the land and see some of these great natural features.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Josh Wise with Ontario Nature. Up next, Toronto Community Housing under review. Toronto Community Housing provides homes for 60,000 low and moderate income households. It has a $1.3 billion budget. Joining us is former City Councillor, Mayor, Member of Parliament, Cabinet Minister, and Senator Art Eggleton. Senator, thank you so much for joining us today.
A pleasure.
So Toronto Community Housing Corporation has gone through a number of executive directors over the last few years. It's had a bit of a checkered past, I guess you can describe it. And Mayor Tory asked you to step in and take a look at how it's operating and going forward.
Right. Well, in fact, it's had a 30-year crisis in the making at Toronto Community Housing, starting with neglect and underinvestment by different levels of government, followed by the kind of turmoil we've seen over the last number of years. They had 4 CEOs in 5 years. The board at one point under former Mayor Ford got totally turfed out.
Right.
A lot of turmoil. But the mayor asked me to head up a task force, 6 volunteer members of the task force that he appointed, and it took about a year. We spent the first half of the year looking at what was wrong with the way TCHC operated on a day-to-day basis, because we're getting lots of complaints from tenants. In fact, we met with over 1,000 of them in different public meetings, and visits to different buildings.
So what was the number one complaint that these tenants had?
Well, the number one complaint was that they felt insecure. They didn't feel safe in many respects in the housing they lived in. I mean, TCHC has had enormous problems with criminal activity, with gangs and guns, and this kind of thing makes people, of course, feel quite insecure for themselves and for their families. But they were also concerned about maintenance of the buildings, infestation of bed bugs, and hoarding problems that led to fires and other infestation problems as well. They didn't feel that they were getting timely attention by the Toronto Community Housing staff. They felt that a lot of the little work that needed to be done by outside companies wasn't being done very properly in their units. So there was just complaint after complaint after complaint. We asked Toronto Community Housing to put together some action plans to try to deal with those matters. But that was just the first half. In the second half, we focused on the organization overall, its governance, its structure, and our final report we brought out in January. And to sum it up, we found that Toronto Community Housing Corporation was unsustainable.
Well, they have if I understand correctly, a $2 billion backlog on
well, that's
infrastructure.
Part of it. You see, it was unsustainable, certainly in a financial aspect, because they have a $2.6 billion backlog on repairs, on capital repairs that are vitally needed. They've only been able to get money for about 1/3 of that, and that's come from the city. The federal and provincial governments, they've asked to cough up for another 1/3 each, but that hasn't happened so far, although things are looking brighter in that regard.
I understand that the new government during the campaign made a commitment to public housing, and presumably some of that money from the Infrastructure Investment Fund will find its way down to TCHC.
I certainly hope so. That's what I mean by things looking a little bit brighter. But there's more to it than that. TCHC is going to start bleeding red ink. Its expenses are higher than its revenue, going higher than its revenues. It has a very fixed revenue base. Most of the people in there are on rent geared to income and have very limited incomes, a lot of them on social assistance. So it's going to start bleeding a lot of red ink. But it's also unsustainable socially. It is too much of a concentration of poverty. Over 90% of the people in TCHC live below the poverty line. What we need is more mixed income.
So that raises a question about Regent Park redevelopment. And that's an attempt to basically level the old TCHC properties, bring in modern, new, mixed residential. How's that model working?
Well, I think that's working fine. And I think we need more of that, and there are some other projects that are underway.
Lawrence Heights was
Lawrence
where
Heights, right? That's one of them that is just beginning, and Alexander Park.
Okay.
But there are only so many of those, but there's still lots of buildings. There's some 2,200 buildings. There's over 110,000 people live in TCHC. So there's a lot more that needs renewal, and that's where that $2.6 billion becomes vitally necessary, because if they don't get that money, they're going to have to close units. Close 7,500 units within the next few years. That's terrible, because we have a waiting list already of some 95,000 households who can't afford to close units and need to build more units, which is another thing that our task force report recommended, that more units need to be built. They need to be mixed income units, mixed being low income and moderate income people, that would help provide for a better revenue base for TCHC and help get them out of the red ink.
So what is the status of the report right now? Where does it sit?
Well, it's with the city staff, and the mayor put it on the agenda of the executive committee in early February, and then it was referred to the city manager and other staff, and they're processing it through. They are expected to come up with some interim report this spring and perhaps some final report on the way forward this fall.
Now, one of the things that's hampering TCHC has been its leadership. They've had 4 CEOs in the last 5 years. Have we seen the revolving door finally stop, and do we have the right person in that position?
Well, there isn't a person in that position other than an acting, it's an acting position at the moment, but it's time to bring some stability to the organization. We have recommended, though, that it become a community-based nonprofit as opposed to something that is totally controlled by city council. You see, they have a board of directors and they have city council, and the board has a difficulty exercising its fiduciary responsibility because it's got city council looking over its shoulder all of that. So we suggest to take it further from the political arena. That will help to stabilize and put the turmoil behind them and give them a fresh start.
Now, I did mention earlier about the new project at Regent Park. Have you had any indications how that's working out, how the community's reacting to it, and how it's maybe changed the thinking of TCHC from being a purely low and moderate income housing program?
Well, it's a marvelous development in that it does bring people together who have ownership in condominiums as well as people that are tenants in rental buildings. We need to get more of that kind of combination. In fact, low-income people, we want to try to encourage them to become owners as well. The other thing that Regent Park has done, aside from new buildings, it's opened up the streets, it's provided new amenities, new recreational facilities, a lovely big swimming pool, all sorts of things that are terrific for the area. So yes, I think it's a marvelous redevelopment of that property.
And the other area that you've also been working with, it's been getting a little bit more traction since the minister made some comments on it, is on a guaranteed income for Canadians.
Right. Well, I think we're at a stage where we need to do a pilot project to see if it would actually work, because what we're doing now isn't working very well. We have too many people living in poverty. We have a social welfare system that has enormous bureaucracy, enormous costs associated with it, and it's not solving the problem. People, at best, are maintained in poverty by the current social welfare system. At worst, they're trapped in it. It's hard for them to get out of it. So I think we need to find a new way, and I think testing the possibility of a basic income or a guaranteed annual income, as it's more traditionally known, is a good way to go forward.
Well, Senator, I'd like to have you back to discuss this in greater detail. I hope you'll be able to find some more time.
My pleasure.
Joining me was Senator Art Eggleton. We'll be right back in a moment. Since the October 19th federal election, Prime Minister Trudeau has received strong support for his new government. Here with me by phone in Ottawa is Abacus Data's Chairman, Bruce Anderson. Thank you for joining us, Bruce.
My pleasure. Good to talk with you.
This is your second report card on the new Prime Minister, and in 10 out of 10 categories, you find Canadians are giving the new PM a passing grade.
Absolutely. We asked people about 10 different items that we asked as well in January. And on all 10, we found a pretty substantial majority said that they thought the government was doing an acceptable or better job. The strongest areas of approval were for level of openness and accountability, working with the provincial premiers, the choices that the Prime Minister made in his cabinet, the personal values that he brings in handling his job, and interestingly, representing Canada internationally.
So the big question is, how long do you think this honeymoon will last?
Well, I think it's always been the case that people in politics love to say that it's the economy, stupid, that's the only thing that ever matters in public assessments, but that hasn't really been true for a while in Canada. There was a good period of time leading up to the last election where people thought the economy was in pretty good shape, but they were still thinking it might be time to change the government. And of course, today we've got 2/3 of people saying the economy is in poor shape, but most people say the government's doing a pretty good job. So it won't be the economy necessarily that causes a breach in the level of satisfaction that we're seeing with this government. Most of what I think is holding up satisfaction right now or keeping it elevated is about the style that the government is using. And by style, I don't just mean the cosmetics of it. It's more the way in which Mr. Trudeau talks about the issues with people, meets with premiers to talk about things like climate change, works with Aboriginal communities to try to improve the dialogue there. Those are all things that people felt were substantively important and somewhat missing in the past. And so I think as long as Mr. Trudeau stays in that direction, a fair number of people are going to be inclined to support him.
Among New Democrats, you show that 88% think the Prime Minister is given a passing or better mark. Does that spell trouble for Tom Mulcair?
It does put pressure on Mr. Mulcair. One of the things that's really been clear in the data since the election is that New Democratic Party supporters are pretty happy with the kind of government that the Trudeau administration is bringing. Conservatives are obviously less happy, but they're more satisfied than you might think on a number of issues. Really, conservative dissatisfaction is contained to a smaller number of issues that have to do with ISIS, with the refugee issue, to some degree with carbon, but not on representing Canada internationally, for example.
And that goes to a point, during the election, the Conservatives thought that international affairs was a strong suit for them, but your findings show that nearly 2/3 of Tories give Justin Trudeau a passing or better grade. That seemed somewhat counterintuitive, shall we say.
It definitely was the case, that Conservatives thought that the Liberals were not going to be competitive with Mr. Trudeau as leader on the question of international relations or on managing the economy, that this has turned out to be a different situation from public opinion standpoint, including among conservative-oriented voters. They tend to look at the performance of Mr. Trudeau and say, it's okay as far as we're concerned. They're not necessarily the most enthusiastic about it, but they're certainly not of the view that he's been a big failure in those areas. And the large majority of conservative supporters were happy with the state visit to Washington and believe that there has been value in the Prime Minister's international travel generally.
Thank you, Bruce, for sharing your insights. We'll be back with The Point. It happened recently. The last vestiges of the Cold War came to an abrupt end. President Barack Obama flew to Havana, Cuba, marking the formal end to hostilities after more than 50 years. Just like the fall of the Berlin Wall signaled the end of communism nearly 30 years ago, many predicted that this day would never come. While Fidel Castro no longer rules the island, he has outlasted many U.S. presidents who had hoped to see his demise. Canada, for its part, did not follow the U.S. lead in boycotting the island. In fact, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's father was considered a close personal friend of Castro. Canadian businesses and tourists have long been involved in Cuba, and our relationship with the communist country may have helped contribute to the thawing of relations with the U.S. Canadian diplomats served as go-betweens in helping to arrange meetings with the Cubans that culminated in the breakthrough in relations. It is this type of diplomacy that Canada excels at and is what we need to do more of. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is right in announcing that Canada would seek a seat on the United Nations Security Council. Our last attempt ended in failure due in part to the Harper government's negative view of the UN. This time, we are approaching things with a more open, positive attitude that has certainly attracted favorable reviews internationally. Canada can play a constructive role in international events as it has in the past. Whether helping thaw relations with Cuba or being a good international citizen, many see our country as a good friend with strong moral convictions to do what is right. And that's the point. That's all for this season of The Point. Keep up with the show and subscribe to our YouTube channel where you'll find past editions of the show. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter @ThePointTV. Thank you for watching. I'm Marcel Wieder.